Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, CEO and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group. And I'm back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. This is the show where we break down the big and most relevant HR issues of the day. We help you make sense of what they mean for you, and we talk about what you might do about them. Joining me today is my partner and Sapient Chief Research Officer, Stacey Harris. Welcome, Stacey.
Hi, Teri. It's great to be on your show finally. It's neat. Normally I get on the other podcast, and so it's kind of cool to get a chance to be a guest on a podcast. That's a fun place to be.
Yeah, it is. It is fun. So recently you wrote a great article about the value of your people data, which I think is an underserved topic. And I wanted to ask you some questions about it and just maybe turn this into an interesting conversation about data, if that's possible. So you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I'm all ears to hear what your questions are, because that article at HR Executive Magazine got more retweets and reshares than probably any of the other ones that I've done with the magazine yet. I do think it was a hot topic for people. So,
oh, good. That's good to know. So, all right. Well, let's get into the huddle. So your article was in, I think, HR Executive Magazine in January. I think a lot of people find the topic of data somewhat mundane, right? And somebody else's job to worry about. But frankly, I think a lot of times we don't realize the treasure trove we have available in our data and the ways that we could use it to tell stories we need to tell, to pitch business cases, to convince leadership of change and, those types of things. So that's what I hope we can do with this conversation today, is just kind of get people thinking about their data and how it can be working for them. Kind of like your money in the bank, how that works for you. You want your data to work for you, right?
Yes. So, I love that analogy. That's a great analogy. I haven't thought about it that way, but it's true, right? Like money could just sit there, or you could be putting it in the right funds and the right places, so it could actually be making money for you. I love that. Yes, that's a very good way to look at it.
Exactly. So I think you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but what prompted you to write an article about data?
So it was funny when, I started talking to Elizabeth, who's the editor over at HRE Magazine, about sort of the topics that were hot. We knew we wanted to write about sort of what was coming out of the annual report that we do every year. And I said, one of the things that I find over and over again that we get questions about from the people who participate is just understanding what is it that they, what are the metrics people are sharing? What's the things people are putting in front of their executives or managers? And I said, we have some data on that, on what are the big reports people are sharing. I said, but the sad thing is that it's not as much as you would think, right? And the things they're sharing tend to be all backwards looking stuff and compliance required information, like, demographics and turnover rates, right? I said, but there's so much data that we collect in HR, so much data and even if it's not as clean as we would like it or as perfect as we would like it, that when I talk to business leaders, they would love to have some visibility into that data. And I think HR is more hesitant than most business units to share their data, right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of times, and like you said, there's the traditional stuff, right? Turnover, what's happening in recruiting, what's happening with compensation, and that gets more relevant in different times of the year, and then demographics. So where are we missing the boat? Like, what are some of the things that you think that we could add to that monthly reporting that would really gets people to start thinking? Because I think we have to, as HR professionals, leadership challenges us, but at the same time, we need to be challenging them about thinking about this stuff. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know if they're not as close to that HR function, or it doesn't have as much visibility as it should have in the organization.
Yeah, no doubt at all. Here's some of the things I think, again, this is from what we're seeing in the data, right? And in the conversations I've had with a lot of organizations, is that Things like performance management only gets shown once a year, right? Like how, here's everybody's rating in performance management, or maybe it gets shown twice a year. But almost every organization, more than 50% of organizations that we survey now are doing some sort of regular check-ins in their performance management process. And I think executives would love to know how often those check-ins are happening, and maybe who's having more or less of those check-ins by business unit or group, right? So it doesn't even have to be like, what is the performance, which I think the executives would love to know, like, can we on a monthly basis show some sort of a performance connection to people, to the performance of the business, right? But even just something as simple as how many check-ins are we having every month is a forward-looking indicator of any trouble you might find in business units or in areas, right? And if there's so for example, a great example is I was talking to someone who said, we knew COVID was a problem. We knew the challenges in there was a hospital, like people were busy. But we knew when it got to be a really big problem, when everybody stopped doing everything else that they were supposed to be doing for HR, like they didn't have time to fill out forms, to do the check-ins, we knew that was our aha moment when everything was not functioning because everything else went by the wayside. And they said it was, and we didn't see that until it was almost too late, where we could have probably seen a gradual progression of stuff starting to slow down outside the business, besides sort of just taking care of people's health. And so, those are the kind of things I think we oftentimes forget, that data is valuable. Other ones that I've talked to organizations about, I'll talk about skills, and we'd love to track skills and have the right skills tool. And that's still a bit of a challenge, but you can maybe track through the recruiting process and through development work, like what are the skills we're recruiting for that are tied to various job roles, right? And you can take a look at what are the skills that people are actually taking in courses and do at least a little bit of a combination there. It's not a true skills analysis, but at least you've got a data there that starts to show you, are we doing development in the same places that we're recruiting for? And if not, why? Again, those are simple and things that we have in our data set, but we oftentimes don't feel like they're as important as, say, how many times people have looked at a marketing campaign, or how often, we get, how many people have made sales calls in the last month. But it's just as important as that data in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And you could actually even tie that back to learning, and where is learning happening in the organization, right? And, are there certain groups within the organization that are taking a lot more courses online, or what are they doing to improve the workforce within their division, right? Yeah. That others could learn from, or that could help us understand what kind of impact that's having on the business.
And I think it's so often that we think, well, that's just HR data, but it's not. That's the same business data as how many sales calls are being made, in my opinion, right? Because that means that division might be more prepared than another division when we go through a big shift, right? Yeah.
Right. And how many new salespeople do you have?
Yeah.
Right. And how is that impacting, is there a shift in terms of your sales results as your sales team evolves? And that's an area where, you can really actually look at what it's costing you for retraining. And that retraining looks quite a bit different when you're training, salespeople versus, somebody who's coming in to work in your marketing department.
Yep, exactly.
So very different costs.
And I think, again, it just comes back to, we have the data and we do reports on it. And it's what we look at when we're making analysis for the year and strategies. It's not like anybody runs their business effectively. It's just what gets shown to the executives on a regular basis. That's the conversation we were having.
Yeah. What do you think about like wearables and stuff like that, or some of the environmental data? Are people starting to use that more or less? Some of that is a little bit big brother when you get down to, hey, I want to track what websites people are on. And, just in terms of a level of productivity, it seems a little bit overkill. But there are some things I know people are doing in that space that's interesting.
There's quite a bit of work. I was going to see if I could pull up a chart real quickly, because we actually had some stats on this. We're seeing it's interesting because about 23% of organizations have benchmarking that they're tracking across their organization, but 16% of organizations are doing something with sort of what we would consider a wearable technology as tracking, right? And there's a difference between sort of like I'm doing wearable technology just to sort of manage wellness versus managing safety versus benchmarking that data maybe against some sort of a broader number that we want to see, like service calls, that kind of stuff, right? That's happening inside of market. Right. So the short answer is that yes, we're seeing more and more wearable data in the market. And we're definitely seeing, a big sort of push back against the kind of data that organizations are gathering around things like productivity that includes like how much are you in front of your screen if you're working virtually, or how much is your mouse working, right? So but we're seeing a 50% increase in organizations who put something like that in place to manage this hybrid conversation, right? So more data is being captured and more data is being expected to be used in some way. Whether or not we've got really good strategies on how to use it is another conversation, because again, having wearables there that are valuable for the purposes of either self-awareness for the employee or safety or audit procedures, right, that have to be in place because maybe so one of the things that happens in the financial industry that they basically have to audit is that person's being watched so that they're not, when they're making financial inputs and stuff, right, that they're not getting input or data or information from anyone outside the company. It's kind of a weird regulation or law, but it's this whole concept that you know where they're at, you know what their system is, and no one else could actually see the data. No one else could actually be influencing the stuff they're putting into the system, right? And it's kind of like a certification of like, I know where that person's at. Well, that's really hard for people who are working at home. And so there's some real valid reasons to have some of that stuff tracked because you have a regulation or a requirement around it. But I think we really have to ask ourselves, does knowing every minute minute of that person's time add value to our business? I think that's really what it comes down to. And does it either engage or disengage that employee? And if you can't answer those questions clearly, and if it is all about, well, I'm just afraid they're going to do the wrong thing, or I'm afraid they're not going to spend time where I want them to spend time, then I think the next question is, well, if they spend time and they still get the outcome that we need them to achieve, does that matter to me? I think that's, you've really got to go through those logical steps to identify that I don't just need to track. I need to understand what I'm tracking for and why I'm tracking and what outcome is it going to be improved or not. And maybe even put in place some parallel groups where you kind of track some people and don't track some people in certain things and see what the numbers look like. Because we always assume people are going to get a better outcome when they're being tracked. What we often find in the data, surprisingly enough, is that you get worse performance from people who are being tracked versus those who are not being tracked closely, because the people who are not being tracked closely are treated like adults and they're given autonomy in their business, which they love. And oftentimes they're more likely to put in more work in some cases. And so you really do have to actually sort of test the waters on what you're trying to do with that data. And again, should that get up to the executive level? Well, should an executive at least know that we're doing it, right? That's one of the things that we oftentimes hear is that, well, this is standard process, but the executives, if they knew that it was happening as frequently and in the way that it was happening, may or may not have been on board with it, right?
Yeah. It's an interesting conundrum. And, managers, there's still a lot of managers who struggle with this remote workforce, right? And you see a lot of organizations bringing people back to the office. You also see a lot of people saying, I don't want to go back to the office, right? I'm going to go find another job so that I can continue to work from home. And, the struggle, I think, with organizations, some of that I think comes back to, have you really defined what this person's job is and what you expect from them? And can you see their accomplishments?
Yeah.
Right. It's not about whether they're sitting at their desk 8 hours during the day at home. It's, are they achieving the objectives that you set for them? And so, one, did you do a good job of setting their objectives?
Yeah.
And two, are you doing a good job of measuring whether they're meeting those objectives? And I think there's now this, I don't know if you saw this study that came out from the UK wasn't a big study, but it was a fairly decent sized study about the whole 4-day work week and how much more productive people were in 4 days. I'm not sure I'm totally convinced, but hey, I love the idea. And that was the big thing was, well, you still have to produce the same amount of work in the 4 days as you would have produced in the 5 days. Well, that is going to put a lot of onus on leaders to define what it is you have to do every day. And, a lot of times our work is just not that way, right? It really depends on what you do. You make widgets. That's very definable, very productive. You've got, a set of criteria that you measure all of that against. But you're a marketing analyst or the comp consultant or, somebody sitting in the office doing work. The way you measure that is just so different. And I think that's looking at what you might take to leadership might be more around the fact that they have these particular tracking capabilities, but that here's the outcomes from that, right? Here are sort of the things that are happening or what we're seeing. And, if we were to look at division by division and we get to some level of productivity, some productivity measure.
Yeah, productivity is one of the things. It's like always like just 20% of the market is showing some sort of using HR tools to have any connection to productivity. And that always blows my mind, because what are you doing if you're not assessing productivity? But the question is it a matter? And even when you're doing widgets, I think is that there's the sort of, am I cutting it right? Do I have a level of quality? Do I get it out as many as other people, right? One of the things that we found is that to your 4-week work week, there's been research that shows like people who take short but more often breaks often produce more, because then they're not doing the fatigue, right? Versus someone who takes a long lunch hour break and then sort of has to work for 4 hours straight and never stop, right? I mean, little things like that. But then again, I think it comes down to the person who's working at that environment. Do you give them some flexibility in how they accomplish that job, as long as they get the number you need and they get the quality that you want, right? And when I think we oftentimes forget that there's probably more flexibility than we think, because we've been so rigidly like, this is how it's always been done. And I think to me, that's the interesting thing that HR can do to business leaders. They can roll up not just the productivity number that maybe is a number that we've been tracking all along, but also talk about ways that we can test other ways to give flexibility and still achieve productivity, and show how, again, those parallel work ways are achieving some of the same things. And to your point, like the 4-day work week, that was an experiment. And I remember I've read that, and it was of the 20 companies who tried it, 13 were going to continue the experiment, like 2 were going to make it all the time, and like 2 were going to go back to what they were doing previously. So it doesn't always work, right?
Right.
But you don't know until you try some of it, right? And I think executives would love to understand, what are we doing to think about productivity in our organization, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think it's another example of how becoming more expert in your own data. What do you have and what don't you have? And are there things you don't have that you need to figure out? How could we collect? Because this could make a difference. I think that's one of the areas that's going to be key for flipping HR from a cost center to more of a value creator for those organizations that are still trying to figure out how to get there. How do I get more strategic in my organization? And how do I show HR as value creators? I think becoming an expert around your data and really giving them data they're not asking for because it's relevant is going to be a way to do that. And I think we can't do that without focusing on the outcomes needed to achieve the organization's goals, right? And I know there was a lot of stuff in the survey this year about that. So that whole outcome focused approach, right? And supporting that data, and how could we get that data to help us shift us more towards growth versus economizing. And in fact, it was one of the sections in your article. How do we grow versus scale back, basically, or avoid cost cutting? Talk about that for a minute and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this day and age, it's really, especially right as the economy looks like it's slowing down a little bit, and it's funny when we talk about whether or not we're going to see a major sort of economic slowdown or just a minor one. A lot of people point to all the layoffs that are happening inside of the tech firms, right? Well, most people probably need to understand that most of those tech firms in the 2 years during COVID crisis were increasing their workforces by sometimes 50% in some cases, right? And so, and in some cases, they over increased because there was a fear that they couldn't get the skill sets when they needed them. And now that things are starting to slow down a bit, they're like, oh, now I'm just bloated with more people than I need to do the job because I don't know, I didn't estimate very effectively what the workloads were. And that happens in business. I mean, no business is perfect. Nobody's gonna be able to predict what direction things are going to happen. But I think when you're thinking about where your company's at and whether or not you're going to need to slow things down or reduce things, some of the things I said is, you have data from the last 2 years on what it takes to restart an entire manufacturing line that you maybe would have never had because you had to shut everything down for COVID, right? Well, that's important data to take into consideration when you're thinking about reducing workforce. If I had to reduce this workforce to a point and I lost 2 or 3 key people, I had to shut the line down. How much will that cost us to restart it? We now know, businesses now know what it costs if I don't have enough staff to open up a store. I mean, we've all been through walking into one of our favorite restaurants and it says on the sign, not able to open, not enough staff today, right?
Right.
Or walking into my local CVS and wanting to get a product in them saying, nope, there's no Tylenol on the shelf because there's just not enough product in the market, right? It's what's happening now. So that's lost money for the person who's selling it. That's lost money for the company. We now know what those cost us. And that has to be built into our decisions about layoffs. We can't just say, well, we know we need to reduce by 10% because the business is reducing by 10%. You've got to actually go through that process of saying, if I reduce by 10%, does that put me at risk in any of these areas of getting back to that situation? And if it does, are we okay with the fact that it might cost us X amount of money if we don't have the people we need in those areas? That's the kind of data that HR has. And yes, it takes work. I'm not saying it's easy. It's easy. We know it takes work. It's why the 30% of our respondents this year basically told us that reporting was their number one challenge with their current HR technology systems across the board. We know that they're looking for better reporting. But again, if I were investing time in anything as an HR professional, yes, I need to improve processes. Yes, there's cool new systems coming down the pike that I should be looking at. Yes, there's a lot of new approaches to doing, employee tracking. But before I put in place any of those things, I should really be thinking about what data I have and what data my executives need or want before they make really big decisions to cut my company, right? And then your value add. Then you're doing a lot more than saying, I just need money for a new HR system. Because that's oftentimes what we hear a lot of organizations struggle with is, well, we know we need a new HR system. Why don't they just sign off on it? Well, we haven't given them insight into what data they'll get out of it or what value they'll get out of it, right?
Right. And I think there's some other things they underestimate in that process. What's the impact to the organization if we cut a bunch of people? And how do we restart when business picks back up? And what about the impact to the people that are left behind and their productivity in the meantime, right? So they're being asked to do the work of 2 people because we laid people off to save money. And so if we really thought about, is that the best way for us to cut costs or improve our business during a downtime, is to lay people off? I mean, it's the $64,000 question, as they say. The
$64,000 question. And I know HR is, they're stuck with not only having to maybe put the data out there, but their executives saying, well, this is what we need to cut from the budget. We just need to do it. And no, not often the executives don't know that they could maybe get some of this data from HR, and HR doesn't have the time to do the everyday work. So I do get that this is not an easy thing. But the one thing that I've often told a lot of HR professionals is, we spend a lot of time with compliance certifications. We spend a lot of time building our skills in negotiations, building our skills in developing sort of storytelling and in how to be good leaders and coaching and mentoring. We need to spend just as much time in learning data literacy and understanding how data flows into our systems and flows out of it, and how to explain the difference between an 80% or a 20% increase or decrease in something. Because I think that's the other thing that we forget, is that our executives don't know the context we know. And so they just see a number. And if someone's not there to explain it effectively, and that's the other side of this picture, right? So they see, we're expecting 20% decrease in sales. We've got 20% over too much, our compensation is 20% higher, just cut the compensation. Well, our job is to put context to that data in front of them and make sure that whoever's telling us that we can explain why that 20% is not the same 20% that they're thinking about as in sales, that there are people who maybe are doing innovative things that will get us out of this slump in that 20% they're trying to cut, and that will actually create a faster decline because they don't understand what the roles are. And it's a hard thing, but I think that's the hardest thing that we have to understand is that our roles in HR are changing, and we're not just there to coach and advise and understand, regulations and compliance. We're also there to provide insight into the data that we provide them.
So in other words, if you switched your major from accounting to HR, thinking that you wouldn't have to do math, you were wrong.
Yeah, sorry. I had someone, it was so funny, after I did the article, someone actually emailed me and on LinkedIn, and they were like, I just want to let you know that, I kind of ran away from numbers for a long time. And now I think you're telling me that I have to go back towards it. And I understand I've got a new data journey that I've got to take. And it was a very complimentary LinkedIn conversation. But I will have to say, just that everybody knows, I didn't start out with numbers either. I literally took every course I could that would take me as far away from math as possible. I took logic because it was a math course, right? And then I ended up realizing that I couldn't tell the stories that would help people without understanding the data. And that's what got me back into doing the data. So yeah, you're right. Yeah. That is the challenge.
It's definitely not easy. And I think reporting in current systems today does not necessarily give you the depth that you need, right? There's basic reporting that people, and again, you have to understand the data to even create a report.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times have you gone into a system and tried to create a report and you didn't know the system that well? So you don't really know exactly where the data is or how to even pull it into a report to create the analysis you want to create. So I think that's also an area that people underestimate during training is the reporting aspects of these technologies that they're buying, right? They learn to use the system and they learn how to run some basic reports, but then they have to go to an expert to really develop a report that they need. And sometimes they don't even know what they're asking for. They have this sort of vision, but they don't know how to articulate it. And they're not really sure if the data's in there or not.
It seems frustrating and so simple, but sometimes you just need to understand what forms are being filled out and what data screens are people putting data into, and where is that data? Is that data being pulled from another system, or is it being something that's hand entered with humans that could have error? I know that feels like, as a VP of HR or an HR business partner, I should not have to worry about that. But my experience being inside of organizations is you do have to worry. You have to know where your data is coming from. You have to know what things we are asking questions about. It's funny. I used to tell, because payroll is without a doubt one of those areas where if we're putting new payroll systems, and we always hear this, we're going to be able to automate so much, our payroll function can be decreased. We're always seeing decreases in the payroll function. And I was like, you just do not understand. The payroll people know their data better than anybody else in the company. And we oftentimes overlook those professionals inside the organization who make those integrations and those connections with your data, and who work day in and day out and understand what needs to be cleaned and doesn't cleaned. And those are the people you need to go to ask the questions and have them available when you want to figure out your reporting. And we oftentimes underestimate their value because of that, right?
Yeah. The data scientists and the data analysts are important people. But I think at the end of the day, you really just have to be able to articulate. If you've got a team like that, that's great, right? You have to be able to articulate what you're looking for, not the specific data, but what's the analysis you're trying to achieve. And then the data scientist can help you figure out, do you actually have that data, and what can we do with it, and how could we organize it in order to tell the story? That's where I think a lot of organizations don't necessarily have that. So that's why they get so frustrated with reporting, right? Because they're the ones that have to go in and figure it out, and they're not really sure how to access it. Yeah. So as I'm thinking about just kind of a final question around what suggestions we could give the audience to help them become better acquainted with their data and start to be able to speak the language. Yeah. And I think one of your points you just made a minute ago is a good one, that you have to understand what's the input form. What are people actually telling you? Don't worry about what column it's in the database, right? Or whether the performance rating values are clean. what is it that people are entering and at what point and who's entering it and how valid is it? And then now that you know that, what questions can I ask of the data?
Yeah. And I know it sounds like such a, sometimes it sounds almost like you're just saying go back to the basics, but in many cases, you really do have to go back to the basics in this case, right? Because so many times we forget that there's a data entry point for every point of data, right? It comes from somewhere. And oftentimes we only see it after it's been through multiple systems and in some report. And to me, that's an important job for every HR professional to understand. But I think it's also, I put a little onus back on the vendors too in this particular case. I think the vendors have to do a better job of explaining where the data is coming from this screen. They put these screens up and we've got notes on what you should think about that data. We oftentimes don't explain where that data came from. And I think that's a real valid thing that we need to start getting comfortable with as vendors and as professionals in the industry, knowing where the data came from and understanding the context of it. I think the other thing is that people probably need to really think a little bit about is that part that I was talking about, which is explaining the data. One of the things that we always say with stats is that the world's never 100%, right? And if it is, something's wrong, right?
Yeah.
There's always a situation where you're going to have a percentage of people who are doing something different than what the majority is, whether it's an 80-20 or a 60-40 or a 30, right? And we have to understand what's our approach to understanding that, yes, we're maybe changing a benefits program because 80% of the professionals said they didn't like how that benefit program worked, but 20% said they did. And what are we doing for that 20% from a change management perspective who may be uncomfortable with the changes that we're making, right? It's really easy we get this all the time. Well, 80% of people are putting in performance management systems that have a 3 or a 5-point rating. Well, that's good to know, but there's 20% who aren't. And the question is why? Because common practices doesn't always mean that it's the best practice, right? It just means that more people are doing this way. Maybe it's easier. Maybe it's because they don't understand the approach, but there's a group of people who aren't, and you need to understand why those group of people who aren't doing something just as much as you need to understand why people say, yes, they like it or don't like something, right? And so I think some of it is this idea of data literacy isn't just about understanding, how to get data out and reporting, but understanding what that data means when we get it, because we're so used to a systems getting a yes or no answer. Judy said, yes, she wants this, we're going to do that. Or, Tim says, no, he has no additional family members to give insurance to. Okay, that's a mark. But in the new systems, we're getting ratios of things. We're getting percentages of things because now we're doing predictive and we're doing correlations and we're doing 20% of these people might be flight risks. Well, what do I do with that information, right? Well, again, you have to understand the context. You have to understand what flight might mean to your company. You have to understand how they got that flight risk rating. And then you have to understand what will the people who see that number actually do with it. There's a bit of psychology that's tied to it. So I think that idea of understanding how to tell the story with data is really, really important as well. I know it seems complex, but there's all kinds of courses on it and all kinds of places you can get insight for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not just a single person initiative, right? Like you're not going to run a report and say, oh, wow, look at the, potential for flight risk. You're going to run that report and get that information. And then you're going to go have conversations with people, managers, leaders of other departments and say, what's going on here? Like let's talk about this. It's not the kind of information that you can report on necessarily in a vacuum. That's exactly. A lot of HR data. And I'm wondering if thinking about this chat GPT stuff and sort of how do we get to the point where we can just tell the system, here's the analysis I'd like to do, right? I want to do an analysis of what my flight risk is across all departments. I don't have to tell it what data I want. It knows what data I need to look at to support that particular analysis, right? Hopefully we get there.
Hopefully we get there with an understanding of the context around it, right? I think because we have a lot of tools that say, I can show you who's going to be perfect in this job. I can show you who's a flight risk. But again, I agree. I think we want to be able to tell our HR system, this is what we want. Help me figure it out. But then we also have to understand every HR system, every artificial intelligence was built off of human beings. And it just means they can do what we can do faster. That's really what it comes down to. And they can put more data together than we can sort of consider. But that means that if a person could have been wrong getting that data, the system could be wrong getting that data. And so we have to be comfortable with the fact that what it's telling me might not be exact, but it is giving me information. Just by telling me that, it's giving me information that there's data out there that I should be looking at, right?
Exactly. My favorite saying, trust, but verify.
Yes.
That applies no matter what you're doing, right? We are creating a new LinkedIn group called Raising the Bar on HR. And I think this is a topic, the whole data topic and reporting and analysis is going to come up in that conversation. Because again, I think we can link this back to making HR a value creator and a more strategic function within the organization alongside their finance and supply chain peers. And so be on the lookout if you're listening to this podcast and you're interested in a LinkedIn group that's going to help you with some of these things. It's called Raising the Bar on HR, coming soon.
Coming soon. I'm looking forward to it because I think Susan Richards, who is our good friend and our partner in the organization and runs our advisory work, is going to be leading that. And I'm excited to see the conversation. So yes, definitely keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, that'll be fun. Well, thank you, Stacey. This has been a great conversation, went in a couple different directions, and I think it's all very interesting and something that we can continue the topic of in our strategic conversations. Thank you to our podcast production team, Kelly and the Brand Method Group, and our marketing team, Lisa and Zoe. And thank you guys for tuning in. We love having you. That's it for the episode today of HR We Have a Problem. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to it on your favorite podcast app. And if you would, leave us a review if you have a minute. That would be great. You can also drop us a line or schedule a chat with us on our website. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. See ya.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.